Now, the words affordable and cinema lenses used to not really be in the same sentence until we met these guys. The DZO Vespid Primes came out in the early 2020s or just before that, and one of the problems that it addressed was being able to have manual focus lenses that have a certain look to it that's a bit more than your photography lens, while at the same time, it didn't cost you an arm, leg, and a kidney in order for you to get a set. But I'm here to tell you that, well, it got an upgrade. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the DZO Vespid 2s. I'm definitely going to compare these two lenses together, but I'm also going to keep it a little less spec heavy and just talk about the image. For one, I think the DZO Vespid Prime 2s actually look more like the Arles Primes, but well, we'll get there. Okay, so disclaimer talk here. DZO actually did send me a few of these lenses, if not the entire set. We're still unsure about this, but in exchange for making this video, I'm gonna keep at least one of these DZO Vespid 2s. Now that may have implicit bias because I'm gonna say nice things about things I get to keep for free. However, I've used DZO lenses for a long time, even paying the rental fees for them, and I've said nice things then, so I would be unlikely to say anything disparaging now. However, if that influences your decision, either buying these guys or listening to the rest of this video, that's more than fine. I'm not that bothered by it, but I will be giving my own opinions as DZO can't see this video before it's posted because, well, I'm making it the night before. So anything they say, they can't really change it now. Now, if you want the short answer for this, you want the TLDR, essentially, if you want a smaller, sharper, cleaner, it's kind of sharper wide open, but also kind of looks like the Arles Primes, but it's also a fraction of the price of those Arles Primes, that would kind of wrap up what the DZO Vespid 2s are in a nutshell. Now, one of the things I like about these guys, especially if you're looking for a more cleaner set, because these Vespid ones, they have a little bit of character to them, which doesn't necessarily work in every situation, and it does kind of sit between that vintage and clinical look, where this one swings a little more on the clinical side of things. The images are going to be really sharp, especially even when you're shooting at T1.9. I don't really find that there's a lot of things like chromatic aberration or blotchy colors or even a cast warm or even overcool, but at the same time, I still find the highlight roll-offs and the skin tones to look very, very good. These guys also don't flare very much, and we're going to see that when we do some side-by-sides with the Vespid ones, but overall in terms of image quality, if you're looking for something with nice roll-offs, great skin tones, and as well as they're actually kind of the same size as the DZO, they're actually smaller than the DZO Vespid Primes, well then these are going to be lenses you might want to consider. But let's watch the rest of this footage so we can get a little bit deeper. Now the DZO Vespid 2s does have a 6 lens set, and I believe it's around $51.99, but you're going to get the 18, the 24, the 35, the 50, the 85, and the 105. The 105 is my favorite, especially when you want to obliterate your backgrounds. I also decided to test this on a variety of different cameras to see if the look was going to be any different, although I kind of forgot in this testing to actually put them side by side to see if that would happen in terms of combinations. Kind of hard to quantify and explain, but I did test these lenses on my Ursa Cine 12K, the Lumix S1 II. I actually shot a couple of things with the Nikon ZR while using the Vespid 2s, and as well, I haven't mentioned this before, but I tried some on the Canon C50. It's weird that I have the Canon C50. I don't talk about Canon cameras that much, but you will see footage a little bit later. So we are going to compare the Vespid 2s to the Vespid 1s, and what I'm going to say from an aesthetic standpoint, I actually kind of prefer the Vespid 1s than I do the Vespid 2s. I'm not a gigantic fan of the gigantic print. I know they're Vespid 2s. You don't have to make the print that big. I actually do like these quite a bit. And this little space where you can see like the focus markings, I could do without them. It's nor here nor there. And honestly, I'm just kind of being nitpicky for no reason, but I will say I could have been really fine with just using one of these guys. Now, one thing I'm also going to say that's the same on here is these guys both use a 77mm filter thread. That's going to be really handy because one of the types of client work that I do. I still have clients every now and again, and sometimes I have to use teleprompter work. And when I use my Nisi Aureus lenses, that outer filter diameter is just way too much that I can't put the prompter onto there. So I need something like a 77mm in order to do that. This also works with front filter threads like the Nisi Jet Mags, which I like a lot, but nor here nor there. For teleprompter work, it makes a little bit more sense to have like an 82 or a 77, and the fact that these both have 77s and also they're pretty much the same size makes that really handy. There's also one more cosmetic thing that I don't understand the difference of, and I'll kind of show you for a second. Wait, give me a second. So this is the Vespid 2, and you can see that like that element right here, right at the front, where you'd think you would find elements for lenses. Now this guy, this is the 50mm, and this looks the same, like the 50mm Vespid 2 looks the same. What is this going all the way down onto here? Why is that there? I don't know. Now that's a little bit on what's on the outside, but let's look on what's on the inside, or the image of these lenses. Now for the first version of the Vespids, they do lean a little bit warmer, which actually looks really nice on skin tones depending on your situation. However, I did find while using the Vespid ones, I traditionally find the image to be a little bit on the warmer side of things. Where on the Vespid 2s, it's a bit more neutral, and I'd say maybe even on the cool side. However, later on in some examples, it doesn't actually look as cool as I think it does. The Vespid ones also suffered from something called chromatic aberration. And another thing that the Vespid ones had and kind of suffered from, and a lot of people didn't like, is that when you're shooting wide open at T2.1, you would get chromatic aberration, which basically means that on like a window or something like that, transitioning to inside of the room, if you look at the line where those two darkness and light kind of meet, you will see some purple or green fringing. This can be a little bit annoying, especially if you're going for a more clinical look, but for a long time, we just called it lens character, which also just means imperfections that might make some people mad or might give some people a look that they want. Speaking of being wide open in terms of our aperture, the 2.1 on the Vespid ones wasn't the sharpest in the world. Now, when you're shooting at a wide open aperture, finding a lens that's going to be sharp at that aperture sometimes is few and far between, especially with cinema lenses. Oftentimes, you'll have to stop down a little bit to get things completely sharp, but on the T1.9 on the Vespid 2s, I did find that it was a lot sharper in comparison to the Vespid 1. I'll also say with a more neutral and clinical lens, the Vespid 2s actually flare a lot less than the Vespid 1s do. Trying to backlight my subject and just moving the camera back and forth around where the sun's actually shining into, you could tell the difference between how the lenses flare. I didn't want to take a torch and just shine it in front of the lens because I feel like that might be a waste of time, but when looking at these two images, I did find that the Vespid 2s flare a little bit less, albeit even when it does flare a little bit, it doesn't necessarily wash out the entire frame. Now, the Vespid 2s actually have an electronic upgrade that's a little bit different than the Vespid ones, and that's going to be the eye data that you can communicate to your camera with. Now, this usually was reserved to other bigger cinema cameras for things like green screen work, CGI, and repeatable moves if you're working with a robot and you need to make sure your focus markers are dialed in exactly. Now, in terms of the cameras I have, the majority of mine don't actually use that eye data transmission, except my Ursa Cine 12K. My PL adapter does have electronic contacts, so this little lens actually works. You can see the contacts kind of like right over here. Let me just zoom in here. You have these little electronic contacts that are going to be onto here, and that will interact with my Ursa Cine 12K. The only problem with that is that because I have the demo set of these guys, these aren't full production units, I didn't get mine to work. Now, that's going to be a little bit different because I also noticed that that little thing that goes on the top on the DZO Vespid 2s, I don't have one of those either, so I'm assuming that's going to be a component that's going to help with the eye data. So we're going to try to describe 3 things that we talk about with lenses, but it's actually really hard to quantify, or much less, I don't want to do lab tests because I don't care. But it's going to be bokeh, highlight, roll-off, and as well as my micro contrast. Now, micro contrast is kind of a weird one to explain, but essentially what it means is that the finer details have a little bit more contrast, which gives something more detail and not necessarily sharpness. Because believe it or not, they're actually 2 different things, which are also kind of hard to quantify. However, when looking at some of these images, it does feel like there's smooth roll-offs between the highlights in the skin and the bokeh in the background. The bokeh feels nice and creamy, it falls off really nice, but at the same time, all of my images don't look like I put the unsharp mask to 1000. This is going to be super nice, especially when you have naturally lit scenes or things that are going to be lit up, because sometimes even when working with darker skin tones, which I mention quite a lot on this channel, when you have like a key light source, there's one right here, it's on my face. When I have that and I don't have anything to smooth out maybe the harshness from being too close to the light over to the other gradients of my face, what ends up happening is I might look like a piece of plastic. Actually, I'm using a short stash everyday filter where I use a circular polarizer, and I'll kind of explain what I mean about highlight roll off, because right now it looks like a smooth transition between the key light in my face, but if I do this, notice that that now looks a lot harsher on this side, and that transition is a little bit harsher on this end. That's a little bit of a way to explain highlight roll off. I'm gonna go back now because this looks gross. I also don't do any sort of bokeh ball measuring because I don't know, I think those tests are dumb, to be honest with you. But what I do like doing is shooting things in textured backgrounds. Now, I decided to go to Hyde Park, which oddly enough, I live across the street from and I barely go there. But there is a bunch of textured backgrounds, there's trees and bushes, and that way we can see what the transition is between the subject I have in focus and everything in the background. And I think it's just pleasing. I don't really have a number scale in order to put it anywhere, but pleasing I think is the best word that I can explain in terms of the out of focus areas while using the Vespid 2s. Now, I'm going to talk about one thing that I kind of say at nauseum, and we just talked about it before, but it's going to be skin tones. Now, this is honestly just an excuse for me to show more footage, but what I will say is that most of the people that I work with in my cinematography, especially working with professional athletes and fitness influencers and stuff, they're going to have varying degrees of skin tones, and oftentimes they're going to look, well, they're going to look kind of like me. And that adds a little bit of nuance in choosing your lenses and choosing your lighting and even choosing your camera a little bit, because you want those skin tones to be represented nicely. And sometimes when you're working with more clinical lenses, sometimes things look so sharp that, again, people look like plasticky human beings, which can get a little bit of annoyance because nobody really wants to look like that, especially dark-skinned people. Working with the Vespid 2s is very much like working with the Vespid 1s. I like these guys a lot because of how it treated natural skin tones, and the Vespid 2s are no different. Despite the fact that they're a little bit on the cooler side or more neutral, and they're going to be sharper while shooting wide open, the highlight roll-off and every other characteristic of this lens still gives you a cleaner look, but at the same time, it doesn't make me look like a weirdo. That's the only word I could think of, a weirdo. Now, this is where I get into my hot take, because I actually think the DZO Vespid 2s look more like the DZO Arls Primes. Now, I did a video on these lenses last year, and I actually shot a little mini documentary with Terry Warfield last year with these guys. And one of the things I did say about this is that they do look clean, but they have like a creamy background, nice roll-offs, but they are still sharp even when you're shooting wide open, which is pretty much exactly the same thing I said for the Vespid 2s. Now, you can't necessarily completely destroy the background like you would use on the Arls Primes because they are T1.5 wide open. However, when putting these two side by side together, don't they kind of look like they might be the same lens, only smaller? Which actually helps out a lot, because if you're looking for a smaller version of a lens to match, my weirdly hot take would be, I think the Vespid 2s are a better match on a smaller scale on the Arls than it is the Vespid 1s on the Arls themselves. For example, using something like the Nisi Aureus lenses would match up really well with the Nisi Athenas. They're going to be different lenses with slightly different looks, but if I use them interchangeably, you probably would be hard pressed to tell the difference. I don't know if DZO likes me saying this, but for a lot less money, you could pick up some Vespid 2s and they would be a really, really nice match to the Arls Primes, albeit the background has a little bit more glow on the Arls. They're a little bit creamier in the out of focus areas, which also might just be a fault of shooting at T1.5 and still being sharp. But one of the things I will mention is that these guys look really similar together, but also one of them is a lot cheaper and also a lot smaller. And maybe we'll rent more often. Who knows? We don't really know yet. Now, you just probably want me to cut to the chase and talk about whether or not I think these are worth buying. Now, there's going to be like 3 distinct categories where this kind of falls into, and my answer is going to be slightly different depending on which person you are. If you're someone investing into your first set of cinema lenses and you can make up the $51.99 price tag for 6 lenses, then that actually makes a lot of sense, because even when the DZO Vespid, the first ones came out, the 6 lens set, I remember costing like a little bit more money in order to get the same amount of lenses. If you're someone that's going to be on the Arls Prime side of things, you want something a bit smaller. Maybe you want to run things on a gimbal, or maybe you just want to use this guy. You want to use this little FX3 killer and you want to have smaller lenses, then maybe the Vespid 2s make sense because it'll match up the look, but also it's a much smaller footprint in like half of the price tag. And then there's going to be the third category. Should you upgrade from the Vespid 1s to the Vespid 2s? Now, this is going to have a lot more nuance to it, because one, you'd have to probably sell your Vespid 1s and then pay an extra $1,100, $1,300 and get the Vespid 2s. Now, if you have a stylistic and creative roadblock that gets in the way of how you use the Vespid 2s, where you need something that's a little bit faster, or you want to shoot wide open and you want to keep things sharp, then that might make a little bit of sense. However, I would recommend make sure those things, those roadblocks, are things that get in the way of like money, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to sell these, or you're going to have to pay more money to have lenses that are arguably a similar spec, albeit different character. So that's not me saying that you shouldn't buy them. I'm just saying that if you are going to buy a $5,000 set of lenses while already owning a $5,000 set of lenses, you really have to keep into account of what things you're actually going to trade off for. And as well as you're probably going to lose money on the sale. But that is going to be my roundup of the DZO Vespid 2s. I think these are really great because it kind of gives you a mix between, well, this guy and, well, this guy. Small footprint and a pretty nice price as far as cinema lenses go. Now, a special shout out to DZO for actually sponsoring this video by giving me these sets of lenses, which I haven't actually confirmed yet, so they might not get these back. So I don't know. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.